Riviera District Court, with its towering columns and gleaming marble floors, stood like a fortress of justice, but today it would become the stage for an unexpected revelation that would shake the very foundation of the country's legal system. The courtroom buzzed with the usual hum of anticipation as officers, witnesses, and lawyers settled into their seats. It was a day like any other, at least that's what everyone thought. Sophie, a local shopkeeper, sat quietly in the back row, clutching her 3-year-old son Leo, who was absorbed in his toy fire truck. His small hands pressed the wheels across the armrest of the chair, creating an almost rhythmic clicking sound, while his bright eyes wandered up toward the chandeliers hanging high above. To him, this was just another ordinary day. Sophie, on the other hand, couldn't shake the unease settling in her chest. It had been 6 months since she had witnessed the robbery, an armed masked man storming into her shop demanding money as her heart pounded in her chest. Now here she was, about to testify about that day. Her mind raced back to the chaos of the robbery, the terrifying mask of the man, and the strange limp he had as he fled the scene. But she didn't know who it was. She never saw his face. She didn't even know if the man had been caught. That wasn't her job. She was just a witness. She glanced at Leo, still happily playing his innocent giggles floating through the heavy atmosphere of the courtroom. Sophie wished she could be as carefree as he was. She had been allowed to bring him along since she had no one else to leave him with. The judge had reluctantly agreed after much persuasion. Leo was oblivious to the gravity of the situation, completely unaware that his mother was about to step into the spotlight of a legal battle. But as Sophie knew all too well, children often see things adults don't. The doors opened, and a procession of uniformed officers entered the room, their polished boots clicking against the floor. Their stoic faces, dressed in the authority of their uniforms, blended into the background. But not for Leo. His attention snapped to the officers as they filed into the room, and for the first time since entering, his play stopped. He stared, his wide, innocent eyes fixed on one officer in particular. Sophie barely noticed at first, focused on the proceedings unfolding in front of her. But then she felt it, the sudden shift in the air, the intense gaze of her son, and the silence that followed. Her heart skipped a beat. Leo had stopped playing. Without warning, the sound of a toy fire truck hitting the floor echoed through the courtroom, breaking the stillness. Everyone turned to look at him, and Sophie's face flushed with embarrassment. She reached down to pick up the toy, but before she could, Leo's small finger shot out, pointing directly at one of the officers. His voice rang out clearly, piercing the room with an unexpected certainty. "Mama, it's him." The room went silent. Sophie froze, her heart stopping in her chest. She looked at her son, then at the officer. He was pointing at Officer Daniel Cruz. The man stood among the officers, his face pale, a bead of sweat forming on his brow. Sophie didn't understand what was happening. Leo had never seen this officer before. He wasn't involved in the robbery, was he? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of her son's words. The officer Cruz seemed to shrink before their eyes. His usual calm, authoritative demeanor had crumbled. His hands shook as he adjusted his stance, trying to fade into the shadows of the courtroom, but his face betrayed him. Fear and panic flickered in his eyes. "Who is this man?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper, confused and uncertain. "I don't know," she said quickly, shaking her head. "We've never met him before." But Leo, his finger still pointed at Cruz, insisted, his voice growing more certain. "Mama, it's him." The courtroom fell into an awkward, tense silence. Eyes shifted from Leo to Cruz, then back again. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Something wasn't right. Prosecutor David Martinez, who had been observing the exchange from across the room, felt a cold chill run down his spine. He had seen many things in his career, but this was different. There was something unsettling about Officer Cruz's reaction. He wasn't behaving like an innocent man falsely accused. No, this was the kind of reaction that suggested guilt, a response that didn't match the innocence of the situation. "Let's take a short recess." Judge Ricardo Salazar's voice broke through the tension, his tone steady but firm. "Officer Cruz, I'd like to speak with you in my chambers." Sophie, her heart pounding, felt the weight of everyone's gaze on her as she tried to make sense of the scene. She could hear whispers rippling through the courtroom. Was it possible? Could Leo have seen something the rest of them missed? "Ma'am, Prosecutor Martinez, approach." The recess was short, but it felt like an eternity. Sophie sat in her seat, Leo beside her, fidgeting with his toy truck again. She tried to calm her racing thoughts, but the air around her felt charged with tension. Her mind kept returning to Leo's actions, his innocent pointing the certainty in his voice, and Officer Cruz's reaction. It was as if the courtroom itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Sophie could almost feel the weight of the collective gaze of the room. Everyone was staring at her son, at the officer. She stole a glance at Officer Cruz, now standing awkwardly by the side of the courtroom. He seemed out of place. The uniform that had once commanded respect now appeared to be a mask for something far darker. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously between the judge and the prosecutor. He was doing his best to appear calm, but his body language told a different story. There was a tension in the way he shifted his weight, in the way his hands trembled at his sides. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. How could Leo have known that Cruz was the one? It was impossible. She had never seen him before, not in connection to the robbery, and certainly not as part of the investigation. Could her son's innocent instincts have truly identified a criminal? And if so, what did that mean for everything she thought she knew about the justice system? The judge's voice broke through her reverie. Officer Cruz, Judge Ricardo Salazar's voice was commanding, "Please come with me to my chambers." The recess is now in effect. Cruz didn't hesitate. He marched toward the judge's chambers, his limp a subtle but noticeable movement. It was hard to ignore given the nature of Sophie's testimony. Was it possible that Leo had caught something the rest of them had missed? The limp, the twitch of the officer's eyes, it all began to fit together in a way that Sophie didn't want to accept. Sophie watched as the officer disappeared behind the wooden door to the chambers, the quiet buzz of the courtroom filling the space around her. There were murmurs of conversation now, whispers between attorneys, clerks, and witnesses. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room lingering on her and Leo. The oddity of it all was palpable. Ma'am Prosecutor David Martinez approached Sophie once again, his face serious. He was a man of few words, but his quiet demeanor spoke volumes. "I'd like to ask you a few more questions. Please come with me." Sophie nodded, her legs heavy as she stood. She felt dizzy, her thoughts whirling. As they moved toward a quieter corner of the courtroom, she glanced down at Leo. He was still playing with his fire truck, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. "What's going on, sir?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay composed. "Why are we still talking about this?" Leo didn't mean anything by it. Martinez held up a hand, calming her down. "Please just listen for a moment," he said, guiding her to a small room off to the side. "I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you something. You said the robber you saw had a limp. What kind of limp was it? Can you recall any details?" Sophie paused. Her memory, though clouded by the stress of the robbery, began to resurface. It wasn't just a small limp. It was more like a drag. The man seemed to be struggling to walk, favoring his right leg. I noticed it because it was so distinct. I remember thinking that he must have been injured recently, maybe in an accident or something." Martinez's eyes narrowed and Sophie could feel a shift in the air. "What if I told you that the officer Leo pointed to Officer Cruz has that exact same limp?" Sophie's heart skipped a beat. But Martinez's face remained serious. "We've been running background checks on Officer Cruz, and it's clear that he's been present at many robbery scenes, often the first officer to arrive. I can't confirm everything yet, but the limp you described matches his." Sophie shook her head, unable to comprehend what she was hearing. "No, this can't be possible. Officer Cruz, he's part of the law enforcement. He's supposed to protect us." "I know this is hard to accept," Martinez said gently, "but everything we've found so far doesn't add up. And now Leo's instinctive behavior has brought us closer to something none of us expected. You're not just a witness to a robbery, Sophie. You've inadvertently become a key part of a much larger investigation." Sophie's head swirled. I don't understand. Why would an officer, someone who is supposed to be protecting us, do something like this?" "That's what we need to find out," Martinez replied. "But right now we need to keep Leo safe. We'll put him under protection while we get to the bottom of this. And Sophie, you need to stay calm. We can't let anyone know just yet how much we've uncovered. If Cruz is involved in something this serious, it's bigger than we imagine." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had been thrust into something far beyond her control. But one thing was certain, her son's innocent gesture had set off a chain of events that no one, least of all her, could have predicted. As the hours ticked by, the investigation continued to unfold in the background. Officer Cruz was kept under tight scrutiny, questioned about his involvement in numerous robberies that were eerily similar to the ones Sophie had witnessed. A pattern began to emerge, a dark and troubling pattern that suggested Cruz's role in these crimes was far from innocent. A few days later, a team of investigators led by Martinez uncovered something even more disturbing. Every robbery victim had described a suspect with a limp. Cruz had always been the first officer to arrive at the scenes. His role was always prominent in the investigation. In each case, he was the one who questioned witnesses, took statements, and often resolved the case only for the victims to later feel that something was amiss. It wasn't long before the investigation turned into a full-blown scandal. Files were pulled, testimonies were re-examined, and as more victims were found, it became clear Officer Cruz, along with several colleagues, had been part of a systemic operation to rob the very people they were sworn to protect. But Sophie, lost in her own thoughts, couldn't help but replay Leo's innocent words in her mind. "Mom, it's him." Her son had unknowingly uncovered a deep, dark secret, one that would bring the entire justice system into question. The days that followed the recess were tense, like the calm before a storm. Sophie sat in her small apartment. The walls that once felt familiar now seemed suffocating. Her thoughts were consumed by the whirlwind of events that had unfolded since Leo's innocent gesture in the courtroom. She kept replaying the scene in her mind, the way Leo had pointed at Officer Cruz with such certainty. How could he have known? Was he truly a child with an unexplainable ability to see through lies? Or was this simply the beginning of a much darker and more complicated truth? The phone rang, shattering the silence of her home. It was Prosecutor David Martinez. "Sophie," he said, his voice tight, "I need you to come down to the office. We have more information." Her pulse quickened. She had been dreading this moment. She thought that maybe, just maybe, everything would turn out to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. But the moment Leo had pointed at Cruz, Sophie knew this was no ordinary case. This wasn't just about a robbery. It was about something much bigger. When Sophie arrived at the prosecutor's office, the atmosphere was starkly different from the courtroom she had witnessed just days ago. The office was filled with bustling agents, stacks of documents, and a palpable sense of urgency. Martinez was already waiting for her. "Sophie," he began, offering a grim smile, "you should sit down. This is going to be a lot to take in." Sophie took the seat across from him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what to expect, but she was certain it would be bad. Martinez laid out several files on the table, each one thick with evidence. "We've been investigating Officer Cruz, and we've uncovered something troubling," he said, looking over the papers. Sophie didn't need to ask for specifics. She already had a sinking feeling in her stomach. She leaned in, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. "We've pulled his case files, every case he's been involved with over the past 5 years. And Sophie, we found a disturbing pattern. In every robbery report, there's a suspect described with a limp. But it's not just the limp. Cruz is always the first officer on the scene. He's playing a role in every single one of these cases." Sophie felt a wave of nausea wash over her. "What does that mean? Are you saying Cruz is responsible for all these robberies?" Martinez's face was grim. "Not all, but a significant number. And that's just the tip of the iceberg." Sophie blinked in disbelief. "What else have you found?" Martinez hesitated for a moment before answering. "We're tracing financial records, and what we found goes beyond simple robberies. Cruz and several of his colleagues have been siphoning off money from the robberies into offshore accounts linked to shell companies. It's a money laundering scheme, Sophie. They've been orchestrating these crimes for years." The words felt heavy, suffocating, as Sophie struggled to wrap her mind around the scope of what Martinez was telling her. "Do you mean to say that Cruz, he's been using his position to rob people and launder the money through fake companies?" Martinez nodded. "Exactly. It's a system, a well-oiled operation that allowed them to target vulnerable victims, small business owners, elderly individuals, anyone they could easily steal from without arousing suspicion. And what's worse, they used their positions in the police force to frame innocent people for the crimes." Sophie's head spun. The weight of this revelation was staggering. Officer Cruz, the man who was sworn to protect the people, had been exploiting his position to manipulate the law and his fellow officers. Sophie looked down at the file in front of her. In it were reports of robberies, names of victims, and the details of how Cruz had been involved in each case. One name caught her eye, her own. "Wait, Sophie," whispered, pointing at the page. "It says here that Cruz was involved in the robbery at my shop. He was the first officer to arrive on the scene." Martinez's eyes darkened. "Yes, that's what makes it worse. Cruz not only committed the robberies, but he also played the role of the investigator. He framed innocent people, including you. He used his position to cover his tracks." Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. "He's the one who investigated the robbery. But I told him I didn't see the robber's face. I didn't even know who he was. How could he frame me?" Martinez leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "That's the thing, Sophie. You weren't the only victim. We've interviewed other victims who were also falsely accused, and now the pattern is clear. Cruz has been orchestrating these robberies for years, using his police position to make sure the real perpetrators were never caught." Sophie could hardly breathe. The walls around her seemed to close, and the weight of the truth threatening to crush her. "Where is he now?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What happens to him?" Martinez looked at her carefully. "Cruz is under investigation. We've already started collecting evidence, but we need more to arrest him and expose the full extent of the corruption within the department, and that's where you come in." Sophie looked at him confused. "Me? What do you mean we need to keep this quiet, Sophie? If word gets out, Cruz could destroy evidence or flee. We've put him under surveillance, but we need you to stay in contact with us. Your testimony could be the final piece of the puzzle." Sophie nodded numbly. She didn't understand all the details, but she understood one thing: she had been thrust into something much bigger than herself. The weight of this case wasn't just on her shoulders anymore, it was a national crisis. If Cruz wasn't stopped, the entire justice system could be compromised. That evening, as Sophie sat alone in her apartment, the magnitude of the situation began to settle in. Her son Leo had unknowingly exposed a vast network of corruption, a web of lies and deception that had spread deep into the heart of the police force. He had no idea what his gesture meant, but Sophie knew that the impact of that single moment would change their lives forever. She thought about how far the corruption had gone. Officers, senior detectives, even a retired judge, all implicated in the scheme. She wondered how many other families had been affected by Cruz's actions, how many innocent people had been blamed for crimes they didn't commit. But there was something else, something Sophie couldn't shake off. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that Leo's gesture had done something more than expose Cruz. It had opened a door to the truth, one that had been hidden behind badges, ranks, and lies for far too long. And now it was up to her and the prosecutors to tear it open and bring the truth into the light. The investigation into Officer Cruz's actions had barely begun yet. Already it felt like a massive tidal wave was surging through Sophie's life. The quiet, unassuming woman who had once worried only about running her shop and caring for her young son had been thrust into the eye of a storm that threatened to pull down the very institutions she had trusted her entire life. In the days following the conversation with Prosecutor David Martinez, Sophie found herself spending more time at the prosecutor's office than at home. The investigation was moving at a rapid pace, but so much was still left to uncover. Cruz had already been placed under 24-hour surveillance, but Martinez had made it clear the deeper they dug, the more complex it became. Sophie sat across from Martinez in his cramped office, the weight of the case bearing down on her. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and unyielding. Outside, the sound of city traffic seemed distant, muted by the sheer gravity of what they were up against. "Here's what we've got so far." Martinez began laying several thick files on the table. Sophie looked down at them. They were filled with details of Cruz's cases, his movements, his role in countless investigations. But it was the last file on the stack that caught her attention, a file that wasn't like the others. Martinez tapped it gently with his finger. "This is where things get complicated." Sophie leaned in curiosity, replacing some of her fear. "What's in it?" Martinez took a deep breath before he spoke. "It's about the other officers, those who were involved with Cruz. We've been digging into his network, and what we've found is beyond disturbing. He wasn't working alone. Cruz had a network of corrupt officers, senior detectives, and even a retired judge. These people helped him cover his tracks. But it's worse than just robbery, Sophie. This is a full-fledged operation that has been operating under our noses for years." Sophie stared at the file, disbelief creeping into her chest. How did this happen? How did they manage to keep it hidden for so long? Martinez looked grim. That's the question we need to answer. But what's clear now is that Cruz wasn't just committing robberies. He was orchestrating them. He used his position as a police officer to choose vulnerable victims, business owners, the elderly, anyone who was likely to have cash at home. He targeted them, then used his authority to frame innocent people for the crimes. Sophie felt sick to her stomach. But how do we stop him? How do we take down an entire system that's been corrupt for so long? Martinez met her gaze. That's where you come in, Sophie. Sophie recoiled, slightly confused. Me? How can I help? You're the one who unknowingly exposed this. Leo's gesture, pointing at Cruz, started everything. Your testimony is key, but we need more. We need to find out how deep this goes, and we need to gather enough evidence to take down everyone involved. It's not just Cruz, it's the entire system they built. Sophie nodded slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. She never wanted to be part of something like this. She only wanted justice for what had happened to her and to expose the truth about what Leo had seen. But now it was clear they were fighting for much more than just one robbery. This was about taking down an entire network that had been corrupting the system for years. The investigation moved quickly in the days that followed, with Sophie and Martinez working closely together to piece together the puzzle. Each new revelation felt like a jolt to her system, shaking everything she had once believed in. Cruz's involvement in multiple robberies was only the tip of the iceberg. As they began to dig deeper into his connections, they discovered that Cruz had a long list of allies officers he had manipulated into helping him cover his tracks. Detectives who had turned a blind eye, and even a retired judge who had used his influence to protect the criminals within the force. Sophie couldn't help but feel the weight of the betrayal. The people who were supposed to protect and serve were the ones exploiting the system. Her mind kept going back to the limp she had noticed during the robbery, how she had thought it was just an injury, something that made the robber stand out in her memory. But now it was clear that limp wasn't just a physical flaw, it was a symbol of something far more sinister, a clue that tied Cruz to a string of robberies and corruption. Martinez, meanwhile, had been tirelessly working with a special team of investigators, trying to track down the offshore accounts and shell companies that Cruz and his associates had been using to launder money. Each new lead brought them closer to uncovering the full extent of the operation. But with each step forward, the danger grew. Cruz and his network were powerful, and they wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who threatened to expose them. One evening, Sophie received an unexpected call. It was Detective Carla Mendez, a member of the special investigation team working on the case. "Sophie, we've got a breakthrough." Carla's voice crackled through the phone. "We've located one of Cruz's offshore accounts. It's linked to a shell company, but what's really troubling is the timing. We found several large deposits on the exact same dates as the robberies." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. "So it's true they've been laundering the money?" "Yes," Carla confirmed. "And it's not just Cruz. We've got more names, officers, detectives, even a few higher-ups who were in on it. We're building a case against them, but we need more time. We're close, Sophie. Just hold on." Sophie felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered with fear. How many people were involved in this? How many innocent lives had been ruined by their greed? "Thank you, Detective Mendez. I don't know what to say. Just keep your head down, Sophie. We're doing everything we can. And remember, you're not alone in this. We'll make sure Cruz and his associates are brought to justice." Sophie hung up, the weight of it all crashing down on her once more. The case was growing more complex by the day, and she had no idea where it would lead. But there was one thing she did know: they were getting closer to uncovering the truth. And no matter how dangerous it became, Sophie wasn't going to back down. She would see this through to the end, for her son, for the victims, and for the truth. The following days were a blur of meetings, interviews, and paperwork. Martinez's office became a war room, with a team of investigators working tirelessly to connect the dots between Cruz, his network, and the numerous robberies they had orchestrated. Sophie continued to provide her testimony, recounting every detail she could remember, but she also knew that it wasn't enough. They needed more. They needed the evidence that would finally bring Cruz and his network to their knees. As the investigation reached its breaking point, Sophie received another call. This time it was Judge Ricardo Salazar. "Sophie, we need to talk." Judge Salazar's voice was firm. "We've got the evidence we need. It's time to make our move." Sophie took a deep breath. "Are you sure this could be bigger than anything we've seen before?" "If we're wrong." "We're not wrong," Judge Salazar interrupted. "We've done the research and we've got the witnesses. Cruz and his associates won't escape this time." Sophie felt a small sense of relief wash over her. The truth was finally coming to light. But deep down she knew that this was only the beginning. The real fight was about to begin, and this time Sophie would be ready. The calm before the storm had arrived. Sophie stood by the window of her small apartment, gazing out over the city of Riviera. It felt like everything was about to change, but she wasn't sure whether it was for the better or for the worse. The investigation had been progressing steadily, the web of corruption unraveling piece by piece, and yet Sophie couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled in her chest. She thought about Leo, who was playing in the other room, blissfully unaware of how his simple, innocent gesture had set everything into motion. Sophie had always done her best to protect him from the harsh realities of the world, but now those realities were crashing down around them. The case had grown far bigger than she ever imagined. It wasn't just about exposing one crooked officer, it was about bringing down an entire network that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Her phone rang, breaking her from her thoughts. It was Prosecutor David Martinez again. "Sophie," Martinez said, his voice calm but serious, "we have everything in place. The evidence is solid and we've got the team in position. It's time to take Cruz down." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. "Is it really happening? Are we sure this is it?" Martinez affirmed. "We've got Cruz's financials, the shell company's witness testimonies, and everything we need to make the case. But we need your help one last time." Sophie's throat tightened. "What do you need me to do?" "We've secured a warrant for Cruz's arrest," Martinez continued. "We're making the move tomorrow morning, but we need you to testify one more time in front of the judge. Your testimony is the linchpin of this case, Sophie. We need to make sure Cruz can't wiggle out of this." Sophie felt a mix of fear and determination. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew she couldn't back down now. The justice system had failed too many people, and it had failed her until now. This was her chance to take back control, to make sure her son's innocence hadn't been in vain. "I'll be there," she said, her voice steady despite the anxiety swirling inside her. "Good," Martinez said. "We're almost there, Sophie. This will be over soon." "We're Sanoa." The next morning, Sophie stood in the Riviera District Court once again, only this time the atmosphere was different. It wasn't the ordinary sense of bureaucracy and routine. Today it felt like something big was about to happen, a day of reckoning. Sophie had arrived early, unsure of what to expect. She couldn't shake the feeling that the courtroom was a powder keg, ready to explode at any moment. She had told Leo that she would be gone for just a little while, but the guilt still gnawed at her. She had tried her best to shield him from this mess, but now she was the one who had to bring it all to light. She was escorted into the courtroom, where Judge Ricardo Salazar was already seated at the bench preparing to begin the proceedings. Prosecutor David Martinez was standing near the front, speaking with several members of his team. Sophie took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She was about to take the stand again. But this time it wasn't just about recounting a robbery. This time it was about holding an entire corrupt system accountable. As Sophie took her seat in the witness box, she glanced over at Officer Daniel Cruz sitting in the back of the courtroom, surrounded by his lawyers. His expression was unreadable, but Sophie could see the subtle tension in his jaw. He knew what was coming. Judge Salazar called the court to order, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on Sophie as she took the stand. "Sophie Hernandez." Judge Salazar began, his voice commanding. "You are here today to testify once more in the case against Officer Daniel Cruz. Can you confirm that you were witness to a robbery at your shop several months ago?" Sophie nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor, I witnessed a robbery at my shop. A man came in masked, demanding money. I saw nothing more than his limp as he walked away. But that's when I noticed something strange." "What was strange, Ms. Hernandez?" Sophie paused for a moment, her gaze shifting toward Cruz. The man who had once worn a badge of trust, who was supposed to protect her, was now a criminal standing trial. Her voice trembled but remained firm. I couldn't see his face, but I noticed the limp. It was distinct. And when my son Leo pointed at Officer Cruz in the courtroom, I realized that the limp was the same. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence. Sophie could feel every gaze on her, every pair of eyes tracking her every word. "Are you saying that Officer Cruz was the robber you saw?" Judge Salazar asked, his voice sharp. "I am Sophie," said her words, cutting through the tension. I didn't know it at the time, but after my son pointed at him, I connected the dots. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The limp, the timing of his involvement in every case, it was all linked. Officer Cruz had been using his position to target victims, frame innocent people, and launder the stolen money. There was a collective gasp in the courtroom, but Sophie didn't flinch. She had come too far to back down now. She was telling the truth. Prosecutor Martinez stood up, his voice calm but resolute. "Your Honor, we have gathered irrefutable evidence of Officer Cruz's involvement in multiple robberies, financial misconduct, and money laundering. His involvement in these crimes was not an accident, it was calculated and deliberate. We ask that the court consider this evidence and hold him accountable for his actions." Sophie watched as the judge deliberated, his face impassive. She knew this was the moment. If Cruz was going to be convicted, the truth had to be accepted. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie realized that the justice system might finally be able to work as it should. After what seemed like an eternity, Judge Salazar finally spoke. Based on the testimony provided and the evidence presented, the court finds Officer Daniel Cruz guilty of corruption, robbery, money laundering, and framing innocent people for crimes he committed. The court will proceed with sentencing. Sophie felt a rush of emotion, relief, anger, sorrow mixed together. Cruz had been exposed, but the damage he had caused would never be fully undone. As the bailiff moved to handcuff him, Sophie felt the weight of the last few months lift from her shoulders, though the battle was far from over. The aftermath of Cruz's conviction sent shockwaves through Riviera City. Headlines blared the news: police officer convicted of robbery and corruption after heroic child points to him in court. The scandal was the biggest in the country's recent history, and it led to sweeping reforms within the police force. But for Sophie, the victory felt bittersweet. She had lost so much trust in the system, peace of mind, and most of all, her innocence in believing that the world was just and fair. But Leo had given her the strength to fight, to speak the truth when no one else would. The Leo reforms, named after her son, became a landmark victory in the fight against corruption. New policies were enacted, including mandatory body cameras for all officers, independent oversight committees, and more stringent checks on police conduct. And as for Sophie, she returned to her shop, but nothing was the same. She had been forever changed by the events she had witnessed and the fight she had waged. And as she watched Leo play in the street outside, blissfully unaware of the impact his small gesture had on the world, Sophie knew that her life had taken a new path. One defined by truth, by courage, and by the unwavering belief that no matter how dark the world might seem, the light of innocence would always find a way to shine through. Months passed since the conviction of Officer Daniel Cruz, but the aftermath of his arrest continued to echo throughout Riviera City and beyond. Sophie, though forever altered by the experience, had settled into a new rhythm of life. The case that had turned her world upside down was now history, yet its consequences were far from over. For her, the battle for justice had evolved into something much more personal, a journey of healing, of rebuilding, and of understanding the depth of the change her son's small act had ignited. It was a bright morning when Sophie was invited to the National Justice Summit in Riviera City, an event she never imagined attending. The summit was set to discuss the ongoing reforms in the police system, the Leo reforms named after her son. She had been asked to speak not as a witness to a robbery or a victim of crime, but as a mother who had unknowingly uncovered one of the country's largest corruption scandals. Sophie had tried to live quietly after the trial, maintaining a low profile to protect Leo's innocence and keep him shielded from the press. But the reforms had brought attention from all corners of the country and even internationally. Law enforcement officials from around the world came to Riviera City to study the new measures that had been implemented: body cameras for all police officers, independent oversight committees, and the AI tools designed to detect suspicious behavior within the force. Sophie sat at the back of the room before the event began, feeling a mix of nerves and disbelief. How had she, just an ordinary woman, become the symbol of such a profound change? How had one child's gesture been enough to expose an entire web of deceit? She was soon approached by prosecutor David Martinez, who had become a trusted ally throughout the case. His presence was a steady reassurance, the constant in an ocean of uncertainty. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, giving her a reassuring smile. He could sense the weight of the moment hanging over her. Sophie had already spoken publicly a few times since the trial, but this was different. This would be the first time she would address an audience of legal experts, lawmakers, and public officials. "I don't know if anyone is ever truly ready for something like this," Sophie replied with a soft laugh, shaking her head. "But I'll try my best." Martinez smiled. "You've already done more than anyone could ever expect. Your son's bravery, your willingness to stand up for what's right, that's what's going to make a difference here today." As Sophie made her way to the podium, her thoughts drifted to Leo. He was still too young to understand the enormity of the changes his simple gesture had caused. But Sophie knew that one day he would look back on this and see how his innocence had brought about a transformation in their society. Click. The event began, and the room fell silent as Sophie took her place at the podium. Her hands trembled slightly, but she steadied herself, looking out at the sea of faces before her. Prosecutor Martinez stood to the side, offering her a silent nod of encouragement. "Good morning," Sophie began, her voice calm but strong. "I never imagined I would be standing here today addressing a room full of people who are tasked with shaping the future of justice in our country. But here I am, and it's because of my son Leo." She paused for a moment, allowing her words to sink in. "What you might not know is that the story you've heard about a child pointing at a police officer in a courtroom was just the beginning. The story doesn't end with the conviction of Officer Cruz. That was just one part of it. The real change happened when people realized the system wasn't just broken, it was corrupt. It was so much bigger than any one officer, any one case. And that realization led to the Leo reforms." She looked out over the audience, catching the eyes of some key figures, lawmakers, senior police officials, journalists, all of whom had played a part in the fight for justice. She could feel the weight of their expectations, but also their respect. They had come here to listen to, learn to understand how such a small act could lead to such monumental change. "The thing is," Sophie continued, her voice gaining strength, "we trusted the system. I trusted the police to protect my family, to protect my community. But I didn't know how deep the corruption ran. I didn't know that the very people who were supposed to serve and protect were the ones exploiting the system. And the worst part, we never knew. We never suspected. How many times had we brushed aside the warning signs, thinking, that could never happen here?" She paused again, allowing the gravity of her words to settle over the room. It wasn't just about the police corruption. It was about the silence that had allowed it to persist for so long. It was about the complacency of society, the failure to ask the tough questions, to hold those in power accountable. "But I want to be clear," Sophie said, her eyes scanning the room. "The reforms we have now, the ones that carry Leo's name, are just the beginning. The Leo reforms are not the end of the story. They are a step in the right direction, but there is still so much work to do. This isn't just about fixing the police. It's about rebuilding trust. It's about showing people that justice can be more than just a word. It's about holding every person, no matter their rank, no matter their position, accountable for their actions." The room was silent, hanging on her every word. Sophie could feel the shift, the weight of the moment. Her words had power, but they also carried the responsibility of the future. She had no illusions about how difficult this fight would be. But in this moment, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. "The reforms we've implemented are just the first step," Sophie continued, her voice resolute. "But I believe they will pave the way for a new kind of justice. One that is transparent, one that holds everyone accountable, one that protects the innocent instead of exploiting them." She paused again, her eyes now on the audience. "And I believe that change can come from anywhere, even from the most innocent of gestures, even from a child." Ashawarawam. After the summit, the ripple effect of Sophie's words was immediate. News outlets across the country covered the event, and the Leo reforms continued to be implemented in police departments throughout the country. The public was increasingly aware of the importance of these changes, and the media coverage kept the momentum going. But for Sophie, the real change wasn't about the headlines. It was about the quiet victories. It was about seeing the small incremental changes in how people thought about justice and accountability. It was about knowing that Leo's small act of pointing at Officer Cruz had ignited something bigger than any one case. She returned home to find Leo sitting on the couch surrounded by his toys. He looked up at her with a wide grin, as if nothing had changed. "How was your day, Mama?" he asked innocently, his voice full of joy. Sophie smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "It was good, sweetie. It was really good." And though the battle was far from over, Sophie knew that the fight for justice would never end. It was a fight she would continue for Leo and for all the victims who had been silenced for too long. The months after the National Justice Summit passed in a blur. Sophie, who had once led a quiet life as a local businesswoman, had now become a public figure, her life intertwined with the changes brought on by the Leo reforms. Yet despite the widespread media coverage and the ongoing transformation in Riviera City, and beyond the impact of those reforms, felt most profoundly in her home with her son Leo. The weight of everything they had been through still pressed on Sophie's shoulders, but in quiet moments when Leo laughed or asked innocent questions about the world, she was reminded of the reason she fought her child's future. She had never expected that his small, simple gesture would lead to such profound change, but she couldn't deny the legacy it had already begun to create. It was a warm afternoon when Sophie received a call from Detective Carla Mendo, one of the lead investigators on the case. "Sophie, I think you'll want to hear this." Carla's voice came through the phone unusually serious. "We've been digging deeper into the broader implications of the Leo reforms, and we've found something that might interest you." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Carla hesitated for a moment, the silence on the other end making Sophie's pulse quicken. "It's about the long-term impact. The changes we made are starting to reach beyond our city. But what we've uncovered could change the way the entire country views police corruption and accountability." Sophie leaned forward, her mind racing. "Tell me everything." "All right," Carla said, taking a breath. "We've started tracking how the Leo reforms have been implemented in other regions, and we've seen a shift in public perception. But there's something bigger at play, something we didn't expect." Sophie listened intently as Carla explained that the success of the reforms had caught the attention of national lawmakers. The reforms had proven to be effective in curbing police corruption in Riviera City, and now there was pressure from other states to adopt similar measures. The Leo reforms were becoming a model for national reform. The effects weren't limited to just police behavior. Communities were beginning to trust law enforcement again, and the media had adopted a more responsible approach to covering police misconduct. But that wasn't all. Carla dropped the bombshell. "There's a bill in the national legislature right now, Sophie. It's called the Leo Justice Act. It's a sweeping piece of legislation aimed at holding law enforcement agencies accountable, with provisions inspired by the reforms we've put in place here." Sophie was silent for a moment, her breath caught in her throat. "So they're making it national?" "Yes," Carla confirmed. "It's gaining momentum fast, and it's being pushed forward by lawmakers who want to ensure that no city, no state experiences what Riviera City went through with Cruz's corruption. It's not just about police, body cameras, or oversight. It's about creating a system of transparency and fairness, modeled after what Leo's actions set in motion." Sophie's heart swelled with pride. She never thought that a simple moment in the courtroom, the innocent pointing of her son's finger, would have such an impact. It wasn't just about one corrupt officer anymore. It was about changing the entire justice system at every level. Over the following weeks, Sophie found herself in the midst of a whirlwind of public events, interviews, and meetings with lawmakers who were eager to hear her story. As the Leo Justice Act moved through the legislative process, Sophie became an unwitting spokesperson for a new era of police accountability. But as she stood before crowds speaking of justice, truth, and her son's bravery, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility. One evening, Sophie and Leo sat together on the balcony of their apartment, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Sophie looked at her son, his innocent eyes reflecting the changing world around them. "Leo," she began softly, "do you remember what happened that day in court, when you pointed at the officer?" Leo looked up at her, a thoughtful expression on his young face. "I remember. You were worried, Mama, but I just knew it was him. He wasn't a good guy. Sophie smiled, brushing a lock of hair from his face. Yes, Leo, you were right. And because of you, everything changed. People are listening now and things are getting better. You've done something amazing. Leo grinned, clearly pleased by the praise, but his innocence was still untouched. I just pointed at him. That's all. Sophie's eyes softened as she looked at her son. How could a moment so simple, so pure, have the power to shake the world? She thought back to all the sleepless nights, the moments of doubt, the fear that maybe they wouldn't be able to fight the corruption that ran so deep. But Leo's unwavering certainty had been the catalyst. His instinct, his honesty, his innocence. Those were the qualities that had brought them to this point. The following months saw the Leo Justice Act pass through Congress with overwhelming support. The reforms Sophie had once only dreamed of seeing were now being implemented across the country. Police forces were undergoing significant transformations, and the public began to feel a renewed sense of trust in their law enforcement. But more importantly, it wasn't just about the laws, it was about the shift in the collective mindset. The reforms didn't just change how police operated, they changed how society viewed justice, integrity, and accountability. Sophie's life slowly returned to a new normal. Her shop, once a small corner of Riviera City, became a symbol of resilience, a place where community members gathered to discuss the changes that had taken place in their city. Leo, still unaware of the full extent of his role in this transformation, continued to live his childhood with the same sense of wonder and innocence that had sparked it all. One day, as Sophie sat in the back of the shop, she received another unexpected call. It was from President Mariana Torres, the first female president of Brazil who had publicly supported the reforms. Sophie, I wanted to personally thank you for everything you've done, President Torres said. Your courage, your son's bravery, what you've both accomplished is extraordinary. I hope you know that your actions have inspired people, not just in Brazil, but around the world. Sophie was at a loss for words, the enormity of it all sinking in. I never imagined this would happen. I just wanted to make sure my son was safe and that justice was done. And you did that, President Torres replied warmly. You've done more than most people could ever dream of, and for that I am grateful. As the years passed, Sophie reflected on the incredible journey she had been through. From the moment Leo pointed at Officer Cruz in that courtroom to the passing of the Leo Justice Act, they had been part of a transformation that had changed the very fabric of Brazil's justice system. Leo grew up in a world that was different from the one Sophie had known, a world where truth could no longer be hidden behind badges and ranks, a world where the innocent could be heard and the corrupt would eventually be held accountable. And for Sophie, that was the greatest victory of all. Years had passed since the trial of Officer Daniel Cruz, the police corruption scandal that had rocked Riviera City, and the sweeping changes that followed. The Leo reforms had transformed not just the police force, but the very fabric of Brazil's justice system. Sophie, Leo, and the entire country had been irrevocably altered by the journey they had undertaken together. What once felt like a distant, impossible dream had become a reality rooted in truth, justice, and accountability. It was a quiet morning when Sophie stood in front of the small shop that had once been her whole world, now a landmark in the city. The familiar scent of fresh bread from the nearby bakery wafted through the air, mixing with the smell of freshly brewed coffee. The shop, though still humble, had grown over the years. A steady stream of customers, many of them familiar faces, came and went, and the community felt closer than ever before. As Sophie looked out the window, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey. She thought about the days when Leo was just a child, innocent, and unaware of the monumental change he had set into motion. She thought about the courtroom, the tense moments when she had first heard Leo's voice break the silence and point directly at Officer Cruz. That moment had been the spark, the beginning of everything. And now, standing here, she could see the full extent of its impact. But even as Sophie stood there basking in the quiet of the morning, she knew that the work was far from over. The reforms had laid the foundation for change, but true transformation required vigilance. The Leo reforms were still being fine-tuned, and the path forward was full of challenges. As the day went on, Sophie received an unexpected call from David Martinez, the prosecutor who had worked tirelessly alongside her throughout the entire case. They had become more than just colleagues, they had become friends bound together by their shared mission for justice. Sophie, David's voice came through the phone, his tone urgent but calm. I need to talk to you. Something's come up, and I think you need to know about it. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. What's happened? Is everything okay? I wish I could say it was, David replied, a touch of frustration in his voice. We've received intelligence that there may be another layer to the corruption. While the Leo reforms have been a huge success, there are still rogue elements within the system trying to exploit loopholes. We've uncovered a series of suspicious activities in several police districts, and I'm afraid it might lead back to some of the same people we exposed before. Sophie's blood ran cold. You're telling me there's more corruption within the system? David sighed. It's not as widespread as it was before, but there are individuals who are trying to take advantage of the new laws. They've been skimming funds, manipulating the reforms to benefit themselves, and even using their positions to intimidate those who try to speak out. Sophie clenched her fists, anger rising in her chest. She had fought so hard for this change only to discover that the battle wasn't over. What can we do about it? I'm putting together a task force to investigate it further, David said. But we need your help. The Leo Justice Act is a landmark piece of legislation, but we need to ensure that it remains protected. We can't let these criminals undermine everything we've worked for. Sophie's mind raced. She knew the stakes were high. The reforms were still in their infancy, and if those who sought to exploit them were allowed to operate unchecked, everything could come crashing down. I'll do whatever it takes, David. I won't let them ruin what we've built. Thank you, Sophie. I'll keep you updated, David said before the call ended. Sophie stared at the phone, the weight of the conversation settling heavily in her chest. She had thought that by exposing Cruz and his network, they had cleared the path for a brighter future. But now the same fight for justice was continuing. This time it wasn't about uncovering corruption, it was about safeguarding the legacy of the reforms and ensuring that the work they had started didn't crumble under the weight of new threats. She walked over to where Leo was playing in the corner, building a tower of blocks with his small hands. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with curiosity. Sophie sat down beside him, her heart softening as she watched him. Are you okay? Mama Leo asked innocently, his voice full of concern. Sophie smiled, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. I'm fine, sweetie. Just thinking about how much we've accomplished together. You and I, we've done something incredible. Leo grinned, proud of himself in a way that only a child could be. I know, Mama. I helped. Sophie's heart swelled. It had all started with Leo's small innocent gesture in the courtroom. His honesty and certainty had set off a chain of events that had changed the country. And now as she looked at him, she realized that the true legacy of their fight for justice was not in the laws that had been passed or the reforms that were being implemented. It was in the hearts of people like Leo, people who, without knowing it, had the power to change the world. Over the following weeks, Sophie worked closely with David Martinez and a new team of investigators. They began to uncover a small but dangerous network of individuals within the police force who were trying to exploit gaps in the reforms. The investigation was long and grueling, but it brought them closer to the truth. It became clear that these rogue officers were part of a much larger web one that reached beyond just the police force and into local government, business, and other institutions. The investigation was difficult, fraught with challenges and dangers. But Sophie, fueled by the memory of everything they had already fought for, pressed on. She became a symbol of perseverance, the face of the reforms that had reshaped the country. As the Leo Justice Act continued to evolve, it became a model for other nations to follow, setting a global precedent for police accountability and justice. But for Sophie, the fight was personal. It was about protecting the future she had fought so hard to build for Leo, a future where truth and justice were not just words but promises kept. It was in one of the final meetings as they prepared to take down the last vestiges of the corrupt system that David turned to Sophie, his expression more serious than ever. Sophie, we're close to ending this, but we need your voice now more than ever. People look to you, to Leo, as symbols of hope. We need you to speak at the national rally to show the country that justice is a battle worth fighting. Sophie nodded, her resolve firm. I will speak for Leo. for everyone who has ever believed in the fight for justice. The rally was held in the heart of Riviera City, where the sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the sea of faces that had gathered. Sophie stood before the crowd, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, the banners of the Leo reforms fluttered in the breeze, a symbol of the changes that had swept across the country. Leo, standing by her side, looked up at his mother with wide eyes, unaware of the weight of the moment. He smiled at the crowd, his innocence shining through. And Sophie, looking down at him, knew that no matter the challenges ahead, this was the future they had fought for. "Thank you, Sophie," began, her voice strong and unwavering. "Thank you for believing in what we can accomplish together. What we've built is not perfect, but it's ours. It's a system where truth and justice can finally shine through, and we won't let anyone take that from us." The crowd erupted into applause, the cheers echoing across the city. As Sophie finished her speech, she looked down at Leo once more. His innocent smile reminded her that no matter how much the world changed, some things would always remain pure. And that, in the end, was the greatest legacy of all.